So in this video we're going to be talking about how to mix your palette up for your portrait project. We're going to be mixing 3 grays and be putting a black and a white on our palette. I'm going to start with a small amount of white, a medium amount of white, and then a larger amount of white. These are all going to end up being my 3 grays. My darkest gray, my middle gray, and then my light gray. Okay. Alright, on one side I want to add my white. This is going to be the black that I'm going to use to mix my grays. And then I'm going to have a black just by itself. Okay. Okay. So, I'm going to start mixing by using the end of my brush. The reason I'm not using the front of my brush is I don't want to cover the whole shaft of the brush in paint. When we're painting, the only part of the brush that should have paint on it are the bristles, and never up in here by the metal part. So when we're painting, this is probably as far as the paint should be up on the brush. Okay? So we never want to get our paint covering this. That's why we're going to be mixing using the bottom part of our brush, the bottom of the brush. Okay. Alright. I'm going to start with my light gray. I'm also starting with a piece of scrap canvas board next to me so I can be testing all of the colors that I'm going to be mixing and the values that I'm mixing. Okay. Alright. So with the back of my brush, I'm going to carry a little bit of black into the spot with the most white. Alright. And it's a really swirly right now, and the pigment is not properly mixed in. So I'm going to do my best to really mix that and make it a cohesive color or value. Okay, so I'm scooping from the bottom, make sure there aren't any random areas of white down there, and I see I just picked up one that was a black area, so I'm going to make sure that's thoroughly mixed. Okay. Alright, I'm pretty happy with that. But before I go on, I'm going to wipe off the back of my brush, use the front of my brush with the bristles, and test out the area on my test sheet. Maybe do a couple tests just to see. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. Before I move on, I want to see, I have my reference image over here. This is a cutout from my community leader's eye. So, what I'm going for is I'm making the lightest gray. So a great way to test out and see if that's going to be an accurate color is to go right on top of that and see if the grays match. And they do. Okay, so we're ready to move on. For example, let's say that gray ended up being too dark. All I would have to do is add in some white to that gray. If it were too light, I would just add some more black. Okay, so let's keep moving forward. I'm going to move on to mix my middle gray. So I'm taking more black. I'm adding it to that area where there was the medium amount of white paint that we added. Okay, again I'm mixing so much so that there are no swirlies left in there. It's fully mixed. Okay, so I can see that it is darker than my initial lightest gray. And maybe I'm happy with that. So how about I test this out on my side piece of scrap canvas board. By the end of this gray mixing, you should have a full canvas board scrap piece that has a full gradient of test strips of your colors, okay? Okay, so I'm using my brush and I'm testing out that gray I just made. I'm not really happy with it. It looks way too similar to that lightest gray. So I'm going to clean off the brush. And I'm going to add some more black. It's okay if some gray gets into this black because this is our gray mixing black. We don't want to get any gray into our black that is just going to stay black. Okay, so that's why it's important to have 2 wells full of black. Okay, All right, I'm going to test that area out again. It's not too different. I'm not happy with it yet. Cleaning off my brush. Time to add more black. Okay. And again, I'm making sure I'm mixing very thoroughly, that there are no random areas of white that are going to be under. And I'm almost scooping up with the back of my brush. Again, the reason we're not using the front of our brush is so that we're not getting paint up in the metal part of the brush, which would ruin the bristles. Okay, as I'm looking at this, I think I might be at a good stopping point in this middle gray. All right, so I'm cleaning off the end of my brush because I think I'm ready to test it out again. All right. All right. That looks like a nice middle gray. And before I move on to my next gray, I'm going to test it out by going on to my cutout of my community leader's eye. You definitely don't have to cut yours out, but I'm just making sure. Okay, and I'm happy with how that gray looks. That's my middle gray. It matches really well, and it's definitely different from my lightest gray. If two of your grays start to look very similar, that means that something is off and you need to complete mixing. Okay, and that's where the importance of the test strip comes in, because you're going to be able to see these and compare them side by side. Okay. All right, so I'm moving on to my darkest gray. Adding a lot of black to this one from the jump. I already know that I'm going to need a lot of black. All right, so as I'm mixing, I'm seeing that it's looking very similar to my middle gray. I don't even need to test it at this point. I know that I need to add more black. Okay, so I'm going in with that black. Again, I'm using the back of my brush. All right. Okay, I've gotten to a point where it is darker than my middle gray. Probably not where I'm going to be stopping with this one, but I will test it out so I can see how it's comparing on my gradient test strip. Okay, that's almost exactly the same as my middle gray. Not quite. It is a little darker, but it's not dark enough. I want it to be the closest gray to black. So it's going to be the darkest of dark gray. Okay. All right. So I'm going in, I'm adding more black, using the end of my brush, and I think I've hit a perfect point. Maybe not. You know what? Could use a little bit more black. All right, but I am going to test this one out on my canvas scrap. And the reason is so I can put some black next to it and compare the two. All right, so I'm seeing these. Almost doesn't even look like there's much of a change from the last time I tested it, so that's a good note. Cleaning my brush, going into that black. I'm going to put some black next to it to compare the two. While they are two of the darker shades on this scrap piece of paper, this darkest gray is not exactly as dark as I need it to be. So being mindful of my value scale, I'm going in and I'm going to add more black. And if you do need to add more black to your gray mixing black like I do, that's fine. Just don't go into this black over here. All right, again, I'm using the back of my brush as a little scoop. And another good reason to use the back of the brush is you can swirl as hard as you want. You don't have to worry about crushing any bristles or damaging anything as you're mixing. You can go really quickly. Okay. Okay, I think I'm at a good point here where I'm going to stop and test this, but I believe it's exactly where I want it to be. Okay, making sure it's thoroughly mixed, using my bristles, making sure that I'm not going anywhere near the metal piece of my brush. Putting my paint down. It looks good. Then I'm going to clean off my brush in my water. Wiping it off. Going into the black, and then I'm going to put a black mark down. Okay, pretty happy with that. And then to round off this test strip, I'm going to add some white to the edge to make sure that my lightest gray is not too dark. Okay. Alright, adding some white. Now as I'm looking at this, I'm seeing a really harsh comparison between my lightest gray and my white. So I may need to add a little bit of white to my lightest gray. So what I'm going to do is create a separate area, or actually I can go into this white. As long as the back of my brush is clean, I can go into this white area and add a little bit of white to my lightest gray. Once again, I'm making sure that I'm fully mixing all the pigment in and that there's no swirly showing. Okay, with my clean brush, I'm going to take that and add it to my test strip and test it. And that is lighter than my initial lightest gray, and I'm pretty happy with that and how it's comparing to my white. Okay, so that's how you're going to mix your grays. To finish this off, when you're storing your palette, you're going to make sure that you put your plastic lid completely over your palette, and not just so that it is covering it slightly, but that every side is pushed down, almost like a Tupperware or a takeout container that you would put in your fridge. You want every side to be closed, so no air gets in. If air does get in, you're going to have to remix it. Another good note is to make sure that if you are an in-person student, you have your name labeled on your palette. Okay. My final takeaway from this is that I need to finish cleaning off my brush. I'm going to make sure that I take all of the paint off of the back of the brush, and that when I'm cleaning the brush, I'm not leaving it in a bucket of dirty water. I'm swirling it around, doing almost like a figure-8 motion, taking it out, and I'm looking at it to make sure that it's fully clean. I'm putting a little bit on my hand to make sure that that water is running clear, making sure that I've gotten rid of all of the excess paint. And then I may just dab it on my paper towel, and then it's clean and ready to be stored. Okay?